One of the biggest traps out there for artists today is that we can easily get sucked into making art for other people, that we can forget the original reason that we wanted to become an artist, that we forget to develop our own style, to figure out our own aesthetic, to figure out what we're really all about. And instead, we chase whatever is popular in the industries where we want jobs. We chase whatever is going to get us likes or watch time or views on social media, and we never really develop our own signal. We never really even develop our own style. When it comes to understanding this, I like to use the metaphor of sound or music. We need to initially develop a good signal so that we have something to say, a clear visual note, a clear note as an artist so that people understand what we're about. And only then do we really need to think about amping that up, amplifying that signal, turning up the volume on it so that people can start to hear us. I spoke about this framework in a previous Visual Scholar podcast episode, and in this episode, what I want to do is dig deeper into the concept of signal, the concept of style, how to develop it, and why I think it is the most important thing that a lot of artists have quite honestly forgotten about, and why I think it's going to be more and more important going forward in this new age of AI sludge and automated artistic experience. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name is Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. Check out my free brainstorming toolkit. If you want to take your art to the next level and really improve your skills, one of the best ways is to create your own personal artistic project. And to do that, you need a great idea, an idea that you're passionate about, that is unique and original to you, that is going to allow you to see this project through. I've taken the same tools and frameworks that I use every day and created a workshop on world building, ideation, and brainstorming. In it, you'll learn things like how to quiet the editing mind, how to enhance your blue sky brainstorming ability, and how to use brainstorming anchors for things like story or even your pre-existing ideas and proclivities as an artist. This is a free training. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So if that is something you're interested in, go check it out. The link will be in the description. So this idea of signal is something that I discussed in the previous episode where I outlined a framework to think about essentially tackling this big question of how do we get people to like our stuff? Often this is something that we're kind of left to our own devices on. People will teach you how to render and how to create perspective and all of the craft-based attitudes and ideas, but often when it comes to getting your work to be popular, it's much more a matter of fitting into an industry. And there's lots of tactical advice out there for how to get a job as a character designer in the video game industry, a character designer in film, an environment designer, someone who designs hard surface spaceships. Like there's a lot of tactical advice for like how to make your art appeal to a particular industry. The same would be for children's book illustration or illustration in general. Every kind of industry and way that we tend to sell our services as an artist has things that it prefers. I think the problem is that in the beginning, we can often chase those goals and desires and really forget to properly develop what we actually want out of art. And it's very easy for those job aspirations and goals and our portfolios and the skills we build and the schools we go to in order to build that craft. It's easy for those to format our actual style, like our actual deeper understanding of what we want to do as an artist. And something I talked about there is how it's important to think about the concept of signal as a very precious thing. This is your message. This is how you really engage people and create feelings and emotions. And every artist has a very unique aspect to the way they create things that I think is very interesting. And this is what makes us unique as artists. Like, yes, this makes us a unique snowflake. But in a good way. This is not a derogatory thing. This is what it means to be an artist. And especially today, where I think a lot of those ideas of hey, kid, just like shut up and kind of get in line and become a cog in a machine. Like, you're not special, just get a job, figure out how to do this stuff, become a texture monkey in video games, like figure out how to model. Like, it really doesn't matter. It's not about, you getting in touch with all your feelings. It's just about you kind of doing the work, right? And just figure out how to work in production. Like, I think there's a place for that. But also, I think often the artists that we do admire who do work in production often also have figured out how to develop their own signal. They're often quite good at really saying something unique. And I think the best designers and the best artists are people who figure out how to take something of themselves and inject it into these larger projects that we're working with. But this is a really challenging thing to do. So what I talked about in that framework was this idea of signal as that kind of real sort of personality that we have that is a little bit ephemeral. It takes a long time to build. It's about feelings and emotions. It's the vibe. It's the combination of your life experiences. And then we have volume, which is often what you get taught to do as an artist. Make strong compositions, use color theory properly, amplify your message so that people will look and pay attention and be engaged and look at your image and understand the 1, 2, 3 read. Understand how you're trying to lead their eye through this. Understand how to engage contrast so that people's eyes are just literally drawn to your work. Again, there's a long history and tradition of this, and probably in a follow-up episode, I'll go more into the concept of how to add volume. And lastly, I talked about in that framework how at the end of the day, often what holds people back, even when they do find that, is that they kind of lack the ability to be persistent and consistent with their work and really sort of keep putting it out there and develop that signal over time. It's only when you kind of keep playing those songs, you keep playing that signal, you keep figuring out the exact adjustment of how the people who like your work appreciate it, the exact volume they appreciate, the exact aspect of your signal, of your feelings, your emotions, your style that they really appreciate. And you continue doing that over time. It's only then that everything kind of really starts to come together and people know you for that signal. But in the beginning, what we often have to do is actually just figure out how to make that signal itself. And again, as I said, that's what I want to talk about in this episode. So the irony is here that I think this, especially in today's age of artificial generated art and a lot of industries and structures that have kind of taught us to automate our own art anyway, a lot of the ways that we're trained to create art in these days are very formulaic. We're often using 3D programs and we're often using a lot of systems that kind of don't actually allow us always to express as much of ourselves as you would easily find yourself able to do with more sort of traditional methods, right? It's a lot harder to kind of get your own feelings into work these days because it is more automated. The processes are more automated. If you think about creating a character for a video game project these days, the steps that you go through are fairly delineated. You start off with a brief, you create thumbnail sketches, and this is how we're often trained in concept art. We're trained to kind of create art this way, step by step, and then we sort of build out more options. And then again, these days you might mock that up in 3D and you might not even start by modeling it. You might just start by kit bashing a bunch of anatomical models and bits and pieces together until you kind of get something that kind of works, and then you're going to iterate it in a particular way, and you're going to probably put it into a rendering system that is the same rendering system that everyone's using, and you're probably going to systemize that as well so you don't have to relight everything. And what you kind of get is, again, not that this is a bad thing, but a fairly kind of formulaic way of making stuff that I think also contributes to this idea that we're seeing with sort of, LLM style, like generative art, where, AI art can kind of do this as well, where it can kind of take those average formulaic processes and, sometimes do a pretty good job at it. So I feel like in general, we have kind of been going down this pathway of sort of formalizing our own art, making things kind of very generic to a certain degree and, entering into these large systems of employment with AAA game studios and Hollywood where kind of, it goes in waves, but kind of every 10 years things kind of change a little bit, but more or less we're kind of pulled along and pushed towards a particular style, whatever's kind of popular that decade, and that we often don't really get to inject a lot of ourselves into projects. Now, again, that is what it is, but it's interesting that despite us being forced and often sort of pushed in that direction and often told by a lot of schooling that this is what you need to do. You need to kind of figure out how to fit in. This is what you need to do to get a job. Again, it's ironic that despite that, the thing that's really the most valuable, the thing that often makes the most difference over a long-term career is you actually figuring out some sense of your own style, some sense of what is unique about you, and that this is the thing that allows you to build your own audience, if you do want, as an artist, to make your own things. And it's also one of the things that, as I touched on, allows you to contribute in really interesting ways to these larger projects. But it's often a step along the way that you're just kind of left to do yourself. No one really thinks about this. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for why this is the case. And so before we kind of look at how do we maybe increase or think about improving or drilling down and trying to discover our own signal as artists, the style, the mood, the vibe, like whatever you want to call it, it's often a feeling that particular artists have where they can do fan art, they can do art of, on one project, on another project. And even though they're doing very different things, it all kind of has their feeling. And you often are really interested in I wonder what would happen if this artist drew this thing, because it's going to have their just natural style, their natural kind of signal that they put out. Before we look at maybe some tactics for how to improve that, it's good to look at why this is the case and why we are here. Because again, that gives you a little bit of context for maybe why this is not focused on. So the problem I think that a lot of this comes down to is that in general, what we have been trying to do for a long time as artists is, as I said, fit into these larger industry structures. We have been trained to, and we have been pushed to, and it's been sort of this carrot dangled in front of us all the time that a good pathway to success as an artist is to figure out how to do this kind of professional work. And that's meant many different things over the decades. Back, in the early days of print publishing, where everything was illustrated, like every magazine for every single thing was an illustration. It had to be drawn. Every soap commercial, everything that was advertising apple pie, everything that was advertising every bit of clothing, it was all illustrated because it had to be, because photography wasn't really that good. They hadn't kind of figured it out. They didn't really know how to print it that well, but we could illustrate things and print it that way. We've always had these kind of good symbiotic relationships as artists with taking your desire to create things and then having a really good job role within an industry that kind of, it often lasts, 20 to 30 years. And people make really good careers doing that. Again, just illustrating soap commercials and fashion, illustrations and just a million things that needed to be drawn until photography comes along. And then all those jobs go away. We're often kind of designed, and all of our educational system is designed so that we kind of fit into these professionalized, polished types of products. And this has been the case when it comes to creating concept art for film, concept art for video games, promotional art. This would be the case if you think about the great film poster illustrators, right? Your Drew Struzans, all these people who, really had to create amazing art, but they kind of had to fit it into a very small window of what's acceptable, right? It has to be a particular style of film poster that was popular in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or whatever. And then again, photography comes along and all those sort of jobs go away. We're often kind of told that, again, the goal is kind of to figure out how to fit in and create professional work. And often in order to create professional work, we're really creating in the service of products. We're not really thinking about expressing ourselves as artists in the same way that your fine artists would. And this is where you tended to have that bifurcation of capital A art, where it's about drawing triangles and it's about your feelings and your emotions. And maybe just a toilet bowl, chained to the gallery is art, right? Because again, it elicits emotion. And we kind of separated that type of art from the practical kind of illustration style of art where your art has a functionality to it. And I think, again, one of the dangers of that sort of illustrative art that a lot of us have sort of gotten into is that it does rob you of some sense of authorship. It does rob you of some sense of who you are by necessity. You kind of need to sublimate yourself in order to make the best cereal packet illustration. You need to sublimate yourself in order to work on a 2D animated feature film. And that's been the case since, 1930s when they brought Snow White to the world. And all the artists kind of had to draw the same. And that's been the case for, 100 years with 2D animation. And it's been the case with countless other examples of art. Is often as professionals, we're kind of told that we need to kind of fit in. And that, I guess, has served us to a certain degree. But the more that, I guess, we start to automate these systems and we sort of get into very formulaic ways of making art, what you tend to find is, like has happened many, many times with the sort of changing of the guard of technology when photography took over illustration or 3D took over 2D animation, is you kind of have to really understand that the thing that will always make you sort of valuable and make people interested in what you're doing is that signal. It's that style. It's something that actually makes you unique. And I think that people who do develop a really good signal and style in the beginning can have great impact on those larger projects. There are many artists who put their stamp on many Disney movies. You can think of, again, Gustav Tenegren, who designed the look of Pinocchio. And a lot of those kind of early Disney films had a real sort of sense of that illustrative style. Or Mary Blair, who created a lot of the sort of color work for Disney and defined a lot of the visual styles. There's countless other artists who really made a mark. And it was because they had something to say. It was because they had a point of view. And this is what this automated kind of algorithmic style of art that we've been forced to do as artists, throughout the centuries, but even more so lately, and especially with sort of video game and entertainment design, we kind of been forced to separate ourselves from that. And it's not taught in schools. It's not really part of the curriculum because it doesn't really help you get a job. And things that don't help you get a job typically don't stay as part of that curriculum for very long. So I think this is just a really important part of your artistic journey that we as artists often appreciate about artists who have figured it out, who have managed to figure out how to fit into productions, but also maintain a sense of style and feeling and emotion of their work. And it's also something that when you're just scrabbling around in the beginning to try and figure out who you are as an artist, and a lot of the work you do doesn't look good, right? And you're frustrated by this. Often the solutions to make it look good is to add volume, right? It's to add more contrast, make it more solid, do all of these things, right? Tick all the boxes to make it a good illustration or make it proper, make it successful. And all of those things are good, but they're only good when they're in the service of an actual point of view, some actual thing that you have to say, because it's only then that your work is actually going to stand out in the long run. So I think it's important to understand that throughout history, I guess this has been probably the most important thing for you to do as an artist, to ensure your long-term success and also to ensure that you're able to contribute well to these larger projects. And also to make sure that when you're doing this work, that you're actually injecting some of your personality into it, which is important for your long-term success and happiness as an artist, to not just feel like a cog in a machine. But I really see, again, the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years of artistry, I think is probably going to be defined by more people doing their own things with all the opportunities that are available now for people to make their own art, make their own products, make their own video games, books, you name it. Like, you can basically do whatever you want these days. And often I think the thing that's stopping people is just not really knowing what they would do and not really having often control of that style and not having the confidence in that. So I think, again, it's ironically this thing that is the most important and is often treated by education and schooling and systems as the least important. It's given a lot of lip service, but it's a lot of talk and there's not a lot of action. There's not a lot of application and there's not a lot of actual education on how we should do this. So don't feel too bad if you're like, this is important, this is what you want. But again, it's not something that is obvious for you. How to achieve this, how to really kind of dial in that signal. Okay, so what do I actually mean here by signal? How do we sort of separate it out from the other things that we're doing? How do we nurture this concept more as artists, either in the beginning or later on in your career? If you're like, dude, I understand what you're saying, but it's really hard to kind of undo a lot of these habits that I've learned from working in production, or, I've just never really figured out how to make something unique, or whatever it is. I think that it's important to look at and break down the difference between signal and volume, because often the things that we're doing that really make our work successful when it comes to getting jobs, they are about volume. It is a matter of understanding what sells, what gets attention, what gets people to look. But also, the question is, what do we get them to look at? Often we're employed to create attention for other people's ideas. So we never really even think about what is the message here? What is the point? What am I trying to get across? That's often handled by art director, creative director, like people above our pay grade as artists in most cases. And when you're kind of left to do your personal work or do a lot of the work that you are really interested in, I find that a lot of people just haven't built this muscle as much as they could. And it can be the case for professional artists, as they're a little bit lost as to what they actually want to do. And often when they do personal work, they kind of we're just doing sort of derivative work that's kind of similar to all the other stuff. Or, you end up just doing the same kind of work you do for professional jobs, but kind of on your own. And it's like, I'm just working on my portfolio. I think the key here is to just break up and understand the distinction between volume and signal. And I think just if you understand this, it will allow you to focus on the things that are really closer to your actual interests, your mood, your vibe, your feelings, your style, and understand where that is separated and where that is different from just volume and like good illustration theory. And often the trick here to understand is that what people will appreciate about your work is that point of view. And often a point of view is a little bit lopsided, right? Sometimes it is blatantly missing complete argument, right? It is really sort of based on a particular style. This is often where the word style comes from, right? It's a particular thing. And in order for it to be a particular thing, it needs to maybe not have everything else. And often I think what happens is we get obsessed and attached to these concepts of what makes art good. And especially when you're going to schooling or educational environments, and you're often taking classes from artists you really admire. And often those artists are going to tell you that what you need to do is add more contrast or add more color contrast or work your warm and cools or create a more impactful composition. Because often in the beginning, the problem is our art's just not very good, right? It's not really attracting the eye. It's not very pleasing. It's not beautiful. And it's that way for a variety of reasons. And often what we do in the beginning is we just kind of get taught to like do these little tricks, do these things that will make it more enticing. And this is the same trap that a lot of people you see fall into when they do social media as sort of creators, is they get sort of trapped into selling sort of sex or violence or drama, or they get trapped into doing sort of retention style video editing where it's all a matter of just hooking people, doing a million cuts. And there's not a lot of content there. There's no real meaning. There's no real, art there. It's kind of this sort of frantic hyperventilating, people just kind of screaming, and there's no signal, right? You're listening because someone's screaming, but it's not an interesting story. You kind of wish they would stop, but you kind of can't look away, right? Because it's important, because we're wired that way. When someone's kind of pressing your buttons that say, hey, you need to look at this, otherwise you might be in danger, or again, it's hitting your fight or flight, or it's engaging your political aggravation, or again, it's sort of dangling one of these sort of sex or violence kind of, sort of buttons in front of you. Again, there's not much you can do. You tend to look, but again, the problem is there's not much there. And that's kind of, I guess, a similar thing that we often get told to do as artists is just make the characters feel as if they have more gesture and movement, add more contrast, right? If in doubt, kind of just make it look realistic or, add some rim light, add dramatic lighting. And I think often the point is that works for some people's art style, but really to figure out what you're about, you kind of often have to really think carefully about what the message is that you're trying to get across. And the other thing is that you often can't really even do this in a verbal way. You probably can't, and you probably shouldn't be able to articulate what your style is, what your aesthetic is, what your vibe is, what your mood is, because by definition, these are non-verbal constructs. There's something that you experience through contact, but they are ephemeral. You can't really copy it, right? And you see that. You see someone who just kind of has, some celebrity or something. They just kind of have a bit of an aura around them. They just kind of always wear particular things. They just kind of put together. They always kind of know what to do next, right? They just have that kind of sense of style. And when people try and copy it, it's not the same. This is kind of what we're talking about with art. And this is just baked into the foundational layer of a lot of artistic existence. This is something for other people is optional, but for artists, this is at the core of what we do is make art from nothing. And it kind of has to have a style. It has to have a point of view. It has to be interesting. And we have to inject ourselves into it in some way. And often I think what happens is as a beginner, you kind of get given this giant book, this giant tome of like, here's all the things you should do to make your art good, make your art work, make your art professional. And the reality is if you actually start at the beginning with Signal, which is again, kind of what I'm recommending, and you just thought about like, well, what am I actually trying to communicate? And then what aspects of that illustration theory help me to communicate it? What aspects of volume are going to help me tell my story? Now, this can be those lowest common denominators. A lot of people, like your Michael Bays, who direct Transformers and all those kind of action movies, some people are just built really liking blockbuster films. They just like action. They like sex, violence, drugs, rock and roll. They just like stuff or drama or attention. Like some people are just built to be a bit of a troll, right? They just love doing that. They love getting attention. They love using those lowest common denominators, right? There's nothing right or wrong. It's just a matter of, is that actually what you want to say? And is that something you want to say for the rest of your life? Because the more you can refine your ability to talk to this signal, to morph particular messages that you have with this signal, and talk with your style, the more that you get that right, and that really is kind of what you're interested in, the easier it is to just kind of keep doing that. And the stronger you will build that signal over time. If it's just a fad, if it's just something you think you're interested in, often what happens is, again, you kind of burn out of that, you get sick of this, you chop, you change. And often what we're after for artists that we really like is for them to build up a body of work. If you're thinking about wanting to make an art book or be someone that someone would recognize, often it is a matter of building that presence over time. And the presence over time can only happen if you're consistently singing the same tune and if you get really good at it. And that way, again, when you have the art book, it's going to be a consistent stuff, right? And that's often what everyone appreciates about every artist, be it musicians, be it fine artists, be it who are doing gallery work. Often people who do gallery work, you think they're just artists who are being crazy in their studio and just putting anything up on the wall. No, they're often having to really focus on like what they're known for to create collections and bodies of work that are very similar, that have kind of a tradition to them. So they change a little bit, but you kind of want to know, like you've bought, a Joe Blow painting, right? That's what you're getting. You kind of want to know what it is. People need to be able to recognize it. It's just part of everything when it comes to building that sort of presence. So it's often putting these things together over time that I think really will make the difference. And for what I've sort of found doing that for myself is, that's where I kind of really started to get a little bit more traction online, when I kind of started to figure those things out. And it's when people kind of started to recognize, oh, Tim Mcburnie is the kind of person who does this, right? And I find that just made a huge difference. It made getting jobs a lot easier. It made everything a lot easier because I had that kind of positioning. I had a little bit of that presence. Again, I didn't even have to do it that well. I'm certainly not one of those artists who has a whole bunch of art books or has people kind of contacting them and wanting them to do all the kind of like fancy things. But still, I found just a little bit of that went a huge way, right? It made a huge difference to just being able to get consistent work, being able to, like have people know who I was. And I think it's just a really important thing. And it all starts with signal. Okay, so maybe that sounds good. I guess one of the questions is like, look, what are some good tactics to really find that signal and that style and to separate it from often what we think of as like how to make my art good? A lot of this comes down to, in your mind, looking at exactly the type of art you are probably interested in from other people, looking at other successful examples of people who have a similar mood or a similar style, and paying attention to, I guess, the rules that they follow when it comes to what makes their art good and the rules that they maybe are less interested in. And this is often the case because a lot of artists have a much more subtle way of communicating their art. It's not to all make your eyes bleed. It's not to deal with sex and violence and dynamism and aggression. Often people have really subtle, kind of interesting, chill vibes, or people are having really sort of moody work that is kind of a bit surreal. There's often a huge variety of different emotions for art out there, and it's good to look at the people who specifically are doing the kind of work that you want to do and get back into that style of being an artist. You may have to kind of unlearn some of the things that you may have learned over the years in terms of what good art is or how you should or shouldn't be doing things, and really pay attention to and look at the skills you're probably going to need to build in order to create volume for the type of work that you are creating. And the second thing is to really pay closer attention to that signal. And what this means is that kind of ignoring for a little bit whether or not the art that you're creating maybe has the impact, right? We need to kind of turn the volume down on a lot of the art that we're making and really just focus on that initial idea of like what feelings you're trying to create. Like what would your ideal art look like? What would it feel like? And then think about just the obvious ways that that is maybe going to conflict with some of the advice you've gotten in terms of having to use extreme contrast or extreme color contrast or whatever it is. Often style is a matter of just consistently kind of making not a mistake, but a very sort of lopsided way of making art. And it takes a while to find this. And the best way to do it is to kind of make sure you're doing these experiments and really sort of thinking more deeply about the feelings and the emotions that you want to create and trying to sort of brainstorm those, like journal those ideas, put them down, create mood boards, and just really dial yourself into that and make sure that is clear for you. And then really just look at, okay, what are the ways that, as I said, people have found to create volume out of that signal? There's many, many different ways to succeed here. And not all of them are going to come from an illustration manual or a list of what you should or shouldn't do in terms of how to succeed at concept art or illustration or whatever it is. Look very specifically at what people are doing that works and see if you can understand what technical skills they are applying. What aspects of illustration theory they are applying? Do they have strong compositions? Are they always using leading lines? Often what you kind of find is that people are really just repeating very similar patterns with their art. When people have a strong style, they're often just doing one or two things really, really well, and they're kind of ignoring a bunch of other ways that you could make art. For instance, a lot of people just paint kind of pinups. A lot of people just paint art that relies on a lot of black and white contrast. A lot of artists just create art that relies on color contrast. A lot of artists, the main reason we like it is because all the characters are cute and funny, or they're whimsical, or they're telling a joke, or there's always a good story, or it just makes you feel a particular way. And because you respond well to it, we often ignore the fact that it's probably not doing everything that it could to be a great illustration. It's just focusing on how to give you a particular feeling. Now, these are things that, again, are pretty obvious, right? And these are things that probably you already know, but it's a matter of giving yourself permission to just really dial that in. Because the trick is that when you're putting stuff out into the world, when you're trying to get feedback on your work, it can be really challenging to work on signal, right? And really sort of play around with that. Because often if you're not turning up the volume, and if you have been used to using some of these kind of things that tend to work, things that tend to trend on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, or if you're in a school, the things that your lecturers or your teachers are going to tend to like, right? We tend to be in a situation where we're doing the things that other people want. And building signal is figuring out what you actually want to do first. And that can be messy, right? Because you're not going to get that approval. You're going to have to kind of figure it out on your own. And if you just give yourself permission to do that and really just go back to basics, just turn down the volume on everything and really see what's left and just be clear about the art you want to make. I mean, it's really simple. Just figure out what kind of art you actually want to make. Figure out the style you actually want to have, right? And a lot of this kind of takes care of itself. But the problem is we don't do that. And we're often in patterns where we're actually trying to please other people. We're trying to do other things. And we're kind of just not focusing, right? And if you just focus on what you want to do, drill down, find your style, really contemplate this, and then understand that this is important. This is something you should appreciate, and look only at the things that are really going to help you to tell that style and to improve that signal, right? The things that are going to make that a better version, right? A louder version of the same song, essentially, not a completely different thing. If you can figure out how to do this very sort of tricky, subtle maneuvering of your art that I think is actually very natural, then it can make all the difference. Okay, let's see if we can do some quick takeaways to summarize some of this information. If we first look at an analytical takeaway, I think often when we get into patterns, we get into a particular way of doing things, it's easy to kind of just get there and kind of be like, why did I end up here? I think if we look at this analytically, what is happening is that often we're just getting into educational environments, or we're getting into learning environments like putting your work online and seeing what happens. And what happens is you're kind of looking for approval in those situations. And we often think, and often what happens is like your initial kind of style or your initial kind of feelings, your vibes, the things that you may be interested in initially, often those systems, right, like posting work into algorithms or going to a particular educational system and having lecturers who maybe aren't as interested in your style, they're interested in getting you employed, right? Because that's what makes their life a lot easier, is that those environments just aren't very good at really taking what is deeper inside of you in terms of style and bringing it out. They're really just good at getting you to do whatever works. And it's very easy to just get into a pattern of doing whatever works, and then you do it and it works and you feel good because you're following approval and you're doing what a lecturer says or what someone said here. And there, everyone's like, yay, clap, clap, clap. Look, you did, you figured out how to put a dark in the foreground, sort of gray in the middle ground and light in the background for a simple concept art style environment composition. And that's really great because now your work kind of looks as if it has dimension and depth, and it's like, boom, okay, you've learned something. Well, maybe you've learned something, but maybe you've just learned a really formulaic way of making an environment painting. And, maybe that's not actually the kind of mood and the vibe you want. And we often don't get taught to do anything else. You just kind of get approval for making art a particular way. And again, this happens in a multitude of different scenarios. Again, posting work online and being like, well, I do fan art, that tends to get more likes, or I draw people with less clothes on, right? Like that tends to get more likes, whatever it is. There's always a thing where, again, we're sort of heading towards and looking for that approval, and then we get it and we're like, oh, thank you, right? Finally, I found what works. But again, if that's not really connected to what you want to do and what you want to say over the long term, you can see that problems arise. And so I think it's just that often we're not taught to do this, and you often probably have very natural inclinations to develop this style of yours that you care about. You're often trying to do it. People are often talking about this. The question is, for me, is just like, how much emphasis should we put on that? And I guess the more I do this and the more I sort of talk to people and try and mentor people and try and teach people, the more I'm like, this is something that is really important. And it's often something that I feel people are kind of missing out on. And I think that just is analytically because most of the teaching paradigms that we have are not designed to do that. They're designed to make you kind of fit and become a really good cog in a machine. And that's just what they do. And if that's what you want to do, and you can find exactly the right person to take you and build you into exactly the right cog, and that is actually what you want to do for the rest of your life, then you'll probably have a blast and really enjoy that. But a lot of us aren't there. And as I said, there's a lot of other opportunities here that are going to avail themselves for artists to have more of a point of view, because I think a point of view is going to be something that is more and more valuable going forward. And the better you're able to articulate a point of view, and especially something that can't be articulated, again, I think that is going to be really, really valuable. Again, going back to this concept of AI, one of the big limitations is it is trapped in language. Inherently, a lot of these systems, even in generative AI art, is trapped in an automated system that is based in language, and it's often based in English, actually. So it's very, very limited in the way that it can express itself. The beauty of art is that it is non-verbal. So when I say you need to articulate it, we need to articulate it visually, right? And again, the more you can articulate feelings in a visual way that can't be replicated by someone typing it in because they don't know what to type in, again, the more valuable that is going to be. If you want a simple way of looking at this, it's that you are unique. It's really hard to avoid that fact. And that's good. As opposed to if you look at that from a schooling environment, which is like, you are unique, but actually that's bad. And what we're going to try and do is kind of formulate you so you can kind of fit into a larger corporate industrial machine. If you want, I guess, some practical advice here, like what can we actually go and do? I think a lot of this is internal stuff that we do. It's a matter of appreciating that this is important, that your point of view and your style are important, that developing a signal that is unique to you and says something that is very interesting that you are very connected to takes time. This is why often it's not taught, is because this is immensely challenging and it doesn't scale and no one's going to be the same. It's very hard to teach 20 or 30 people how to all be unique, right? Because how do you define success? How can you mark that? How can you grade that? It just doesn't work, right? So often what they're trying to do is say like, hey, we got a whole bunch of, round holes here. So unless you're a round peg, then it's time to shave all those edges off, right? That's typically what's going on. And just appreciating that this is an important thing, that it does take time, that developing and nurturing and figuring out, discovering and bringing forth your own point of view, your own signal, your own feelings, emotions, kind of what someone who's scrolling through a sea of other nonsense on the internet, on one of these social media things, right? When they're going to see your work, they're going to get a feeling. They're going to touch you as an artist, and you're going to give them a particular feeling, a particular mood. It's a particular thing. And they're just going to go like, oh, that's interesting. That's quite unique, right? Like that's what I want. But somehow that is something that I want in my life, right? I want to have that feeling that I get when I see a particular person's art. And that means you might want to buy it and put it in your hallway, or you're just going to follow that person and you're just interested when they kind of show you things. Because again, it just gives you that unique point of view. This is a hard thing to do. And I think if you just understand and appreciate that it's worth putting time in, that can often change everything that you need. The other thing that I do is similar to what I've said, is really focus on exactly the type of art that you want to make and how other people have already managed to make it succeed, and focus a little bit more on that than what is this kind of these tomes of illustration theory. Again, this stuff is good. All the different ways that people have figured out throughout the last 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000, 100,000, who knows? All of the stuff we figured out about how to make people pay attention to you, through visual means, through composition and all the theory, that's good. But that's a volume, right? That's what we do when we figure out what we have to say. And I think until you really have that clear, it's hard to add that. Thirdly, I'd say that, again, this is not something where I'm suggesting that you just sit in a hole and kind of figure out what your style is until you kind of come out. But something that rather you do all of these things as one. And again, that might be a little bit counterintuitive, but often you do need to experiment. You do need to have an idea for what your style is or what you have to say. And you have to be like, well, how would I make that really impactful? How would I make that really beautiful or harmonious? How would I make that work? How would I make that match the feelings that I have? The feeling that you have inside you about how this particular artwork you're going to do, this character, this idea, this story, like whatever it is, how do you communicate that feeling to other people through your chosen medium? Again, it's going to take a lot of experimentation to figure that out, to figure out which volume knob to turn up, how to amplify that signal. It's not as if you just find the signal and then turn up the volume. It's the specific way and the tools, right? Going through, again, books that I often talk about, like Creative Illustration by Andrew Loomis, all the different courses you can take that will teach you how to paint well, draw well. All that stuff's good. But it's really the best when those things are in service of your actual message and you're figuring out how to turn the volume up and amplify the things that you're really interested in. And it's just important to understand that at the baseline, if you start with that thing being the most important, it just clarifies everything else. And as you learn to create good art, you'll be making good art that fits your particular style. If we look at this from a philosophical or spiritual point of view, I guess the interesting thing here is talking about the fact that this is a challenge kind of unearths, I think, the fact that the search that you have is also part of this journey, that your signal actually is aided by the challenges that you go through to really figure out what you are about. Ideally, you would just say, hey, this is what I'm all about. This is the style. This is what I want people to feel when they look at my art. But often, I think what you find is actually it's a little bit more challenging than that. And it does take people a while to really figure it out and figure out how to amplify their message and figure out what they're all about. That's not just fine. I think it is actually part of the message that you eventually end up with. The more that you go through a little bit of challenge when it comes to this, the more you have to dig. I guess the more interesting that point of view is going to be. And I think the search for your point of view, the search for your style, for your feeling, the emotions that you have, for refining what that signal is, I think actually makes up a large part of the nuance and the texture of it. So although it can seem frustrating and like, okay, like how do I just find it? I just want the shortcut. Just understand that, again, part of how you build this is to find it and to discover it. And then that's part of the fun. And it's also part of, I think, what will ultimately make it work. All right, that's all we got time for on this particular episode. Let me know whether this one helped out. It's a long way to go to just talk about the fact that it's important to find your style. But I have found there's a lot of lip service paid to this over my sort of years teaching people, being in large institutional educational environments. A lot of people like to talk about it, but it's often used as a way to kind of essentially say, hey, if your art isn't that good, if your art really isn't getting that much attention, maybe that's just your style. And I think what we have to do is actually say, no, someone who has an effective style, right, is going to be able to translate that into other people being interested in it, I think, right? I mean, if you genuinely have something interesting to say, it is a matter of getting this right, really figuring out how to amplify whatever style you have, not just kind of say, oh, that person just has a style and that's why their work isn't very good and they're not doing what we're doing here. That you actually can do both and you should do both, of figuring out something that is unique and then figuring out how to make a lot of people like that. And that if you just use all the tools that we've built over the years, over the decades, and a lot of the information we've really built quite lately about how to get attention online with kind of TikTok, Instagram, all these kind of hyper, attention economy things, you can use a lot of that in service of something I think that is a lot more interesting. So anyway, let me know if that helped out. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought. Other than that, catch you around on the next one.